Are mornings in the low country of Missouri when the land holds its breath. The fields stretch out flat and still, mile after mile of dark earth and open sky, and a man who has worked that ground long enough learns to read its silences the way other men read words. Morning, the silence is wrong. An old farmer stands on his porch. The coffee in his hand has gone cold. Below him, where there should be green rows of young wheat catching the first light, there is water. Still, dark water, spreading to every fence line, swallowing everything he owns. And there was no rain last night. There was no rain. Somewhere to the north, a wall of packed earth runs in a straight machine-made line across the low ground. Behind it, $68 million waits. And a letter is already in the mail. Now let's step into the story. The morning came gray and windless, the way certain mornings do, when the land is about to change, and no one has yet told the men who live on it. Alden Boyd stepped onto his porch the way he had stepped onto it. For the better part of 50 years, a tin cup of coffee cooling in his hand and the boards creaking under boots that knew every soft place in the wood. He was 72 years old that spring, and his body had learned to move slowly, not out of weakness but out of habit, the careful economy of a man who has learned that most things break when you hurry them. He lifted the cup toward his mouth, and he stopped. Below the porch, where his low ground rolled out toward the tree line, the land was gone. Not gone the way a thing vanishes, gone the way a thing drowns. Nearly 70 acres lay under a sheet of muddy water that had no business being there, water the color of weak coffee, still as glass, spread flat and wrong across ground that should have been green with young wheat. The wheat was under it. He could see the faint lines of the rows, fading into the shallows like the ribs of something sunk, and past those the water simply took over, reaching to the fence line and beyond it, catching the flat gray light so that from the porch it looked less like a flood and more like Nuss had lain down in his fields and refused to get up. He stood very still. He listened. There had been no rain. That was the thing his mind reached for and could not hold, because a man who has farmed one piece of ground for 4 decades keeps a record of the weather in his bones, and the night before had been dry. So dry the dust had risen off the lane when his granddaughter drove in from her shift at the feed store. He had gone to bed with the windows open, and the frogs quiet, and the moon hard and white over a field that was where it was supposed to be, and now this, water where there had been no rain to bring it. The coffee had gone cold in his hand. He set it on the rail and did not drink it. Behind him, the screen door tapped its frame, and Sadie came out onto the porch in her socks, her hair still pushed to one side from the pillow. She was 20 that year, his son's girl, come to live with him the winter before, after her own young life had folded in on itself in the ordinary ways young lives do. And she had brought into the old house a kind of noise the place had been missing since his wife passed. She stopped beside him with a yawn half-formed on her face, and then she saw what he was seeing, and the yawn died in her throat. "Grandpa," she said. That was all. He didn't answer right away. He was already reading the water. That was the thing about Alden Boyd that people who met him late never quite understood. The way his silence was not emptiness, but attention. The way he could stand at the edge of a thing and take it apart with his eyes before he ever said a word about it. He read the way the flood lay across his ground, and something in it was wrong in a way he could not yet name, but could already feel. The way you feel a note played slightly out of tune before you can say which note it is. Water runs downhill. That is the one law a farmer never argues with. His low ground was low, and so water gathering there was no mystery in itself. But he knew this land the way he knew the veins on the backs of his own hands, and the water was not sitting where the slope would put it. It had been pushed. It had come from somewhere and been shoved across his fields with a purpose water does not have on its own. And when he lifted his eyes and followed the flat sheet of it back to its far edge, back to where it thinned and darkened along the northern fence, he already half knew what he was going to find. "Get your boots," he said quietly. They walked it together, the old man and the girl, down off the porch and along the high edge of the yard where the ground still held. The mud sucked at their boots the moment they left the gravel. Alden went slow, testing each step, his eyes moving from the water to the fence line, to the far northern corner, where his property ended and the neighbors began. Sadie followed a half step behind, saying nothing, because she had already learned in her months with him that when he went quiet like this, it was best to let him work. They reached the northern fence, and there Alden stopped and stood a long time, looking at the thing that had risen beside his land while he slept. It came up out of the flat country like something that did not belong to it, a long raw wall of packed earth, freshly cut and dark, running in a straight, machine-made line across ground that had never known a straight line in all the years he had farmed beside it. A levee. They had built a levee. Beyond it, past the new earthwork, he could see the beginnings of the thing it was meant to protect. The graded pads, the staked-out grids, the yellow machines sitting quiet in the early light, the bones of a project that had come to Corliss County the way these things come now, all at once and from far away, backed by money no one who lived here had ever seen. He knew whose it was. Everyone in the county knew. Meridian State Bank had been buying up the flat ground north of Cedar Creek for two quietly at first, and then not so quietly. Hundreds of acres bought and cleared and folded into something they called the Meridian Logistics Park. $68 million promise of warehouses and truck lanes and jobs, blessed by the county commissioners from a podium with a banner strung up behind them. Alden had watched it come the way you watch weather come, without much feeling, because it was not on his land and a man learns to mind his own fences. But now the water told a different story. He stood at the base of that new wall and read the ground the way another man reads a page, and he saw how the earthwork sat, how it had taken the natural fall of the land and closed it off like a hand closing over a spring. The water that should have crossed the low country and run south toward the creek had come up against that wall and found nowhere to go but sideways, sideways, across everything he owned. Sadie came up beside him. She looked at the levee and then back at the drowned fields, and she did the plain arithmetic any young person would do. They did this, she said. They put that up, and it pushed all the water onto us. Alden didn't answer for a moment. When he did, he said it low, almost to himself, his eyes still on the wall. It isn't just pushed to the side, he said. The water's running the wrong way. She looked at him. What do you mean, the wrong way? But he only shook his head, because he did not yet have the words, only the feeling, the old deep instinct that this flood did not obey the rules floods obey, that the water was showing up in places the slope of the land could not account for, and that whatever was happening not only across the surface of his fields but somewhere underneath them, down in the dark below the dirt where a man cannot see. Turned it over and could not make it lie flat, and that troubled him more than the water did. They stood there in the wet gray morning, the two of them, and behind the wall the yellow machines waited, and the water lay across 70 acres of drowned wheat, still and patient and wrong. To understand what that flood meant to Alden Boyd, you have to understand what the land was to him, because by that spring the two had grown so far into each other that you could not have said where the man ended and the ground began. His father had bought the place when Alden was a boy and worked it until his hands gave out, and then Alden had worked it, and there was not a fence post on the whole farm he had not either set himself or watched his father set. He had married on this land. He had buried his wife from it, 3 springs back, on a rise under a bur oak where you could see the whole bottom laid out below. He had raised his children on it and watched them leave it for cities and easier work, the way children do, until only Sadie had ever come back. 40 years and more he had farmed it, and it had given him a life, not a rich one, but a whole one, and he had asked nothing more of it than that. The house he lived in was old and wooden, and it leaned a little to the west, the way old houses do when they have stood a long time against the same wind, and in the barn beside it sat the tractor. That tractor mattered in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who had not known the man who bought it. It was more than 50 years old, a machine his father had bought new and driven until the paint wore off the seat, and Alden had kept it running all this time, not because he could not have bought newer, but because it was his father's, and because a thing a man has cared for long enough stops being a machine and becomes something nearer to kin. Greased it and coaxed it and talked to it under his breath on cold mornings, and it started for him when it would start for no one else. And then there was the debt. That was the other thing, the thing that sat behind every account and gave the flood its teeth. $42,000 still owed on the place, and owed to the very bank whose levee now stood dark and dripping at the edge of his fields. He had taken the loan years back to carry the farm through a bad stretch, the way farmers do, meaning to pay it down and never quite getting clear of it, and it had ridden there year after year, a manageable weight, the kind of quiet debt a working farm carries the way a man carries a bad knee, aware of it, not stopped by it. He made his payments. He had always made his payments, but he made them out of what the land gave him, and the land could only give if it could grow. And now his low ground was under water, and the young wheat was already beginning to soften and rot beneath it. And for the first time in a long while, the number 42,000 had begun to feel like a hand closing slowly at his throat. He was not a foolish man, and he had known in a general way, the way everyone in the county knew, that the bank wanted ground in this stretch. What he had never let himself fully sit with, until he stood at the foot of that levee and read the water, was that his own farm sat in exactly the wrong place to be left alone. His 100 and some acres lay directly between the natural drainage of the whole low country and the road that would lead into the new project. A piece of ground the developers needed and could not simply route around. They had come to him about it. More than once over the past 2 years, men in clean trucks had turned up his lane with offers, polite the first time, less patient the next, and each time Alden had listened and thanked them and told them the land was not for sale. It had not been for sale when his father held it, and it would not be for sale while he held it, and he had said so plainly and believed that was the end of it. The offers had changed after that. They stopped sounding like offers and started sounding like warnings. A man from the bank had sat at Alden's own kitchen table not 2 months before the flood and explained to him, in the reasonable voice reasonable men use when they are threatening you, that property values in the area were uncertain, that a farm this close to major construction might well see its worth decline, that a wise man in Alden's position, at Alden's age, with a granddaughter to think of, might want to sell now while the selling was good. Alden had poured the man more coffee and let him talk himself out and said almost nothing, and the man had gone away frustrated, and Alden had thought about it for a day, and then set it down and let it go. Now, standing in the ruin of his fields, he picked it back up, and it had a different weight in his hand than it had before, because as the days went by, the water did not recede, it spread. Within 2 weeks, it had climbed across nearly half the farm, creeping up the gentle rise toward the buildings, and the young wheat that had gone under first began to come apart in the warm standing water, turning slick and yellow, and then a black that smelled of rot on the evening air, the smell of a whole season quietly dying. The fences in the low ground worked loose in the softened earth and leaned, and finally went down, and Alden and Sadie spent long, wet days driving the few head of cattle up onto the high ground behind the barn, wading and slipping and cursing under their breath, throwing together a rough shelter out of what lumber they had, while a cold rain that had refused to come when it might have helped now came and made everything worse. Alden's back ached at night from work he was too old to be doing. His boots had not been fully dry in a week, and still the water rose. It was in the middle of all that, on an afternoon when he had just come up from the barn with mud drying to his forearms, that the mail brought a letter from the bank. He read it standing in the yard. It was a payment reminder, printed and polite, noting the amount due and the date it fell due, and expressing the bank's confidence that Mr. Boyd would meet his obligations as he always had. And clipped behind it on separate paper was something else, an offer. The bank, the letter explained, was aware of the difficulties Mr. Boyd's property had lately suffered, and out of a sincere wish to help him avoid further loss, it was prepared to purchase the farm entire, house and land and all, for a figure Alden had to read twice to be sure he had read right. It was nearly a third below what the place was worth. They called it, in the letter, a way to protect him from further risk. He stood a long time in the yard with those 2 pages in his hand, the reminder and the offer, the threat and the mercy printed the same day, folded into the same envelope, and a cold understanding settled over him, not as a shock but as a slow certainty the way the temperature drops in the hour before dark. They had not sent him an offer to help him. They had sent him an offer because they had drowned his fields, and now they meant to buy those fields cheap while the water still lay on them. And if he would not sell, they would simply wait, patient as the flood itself, for the ruined season to make him unable to pay. And then they would take through the loan what he would not hand them across a table. He folded the 2 pages together and put them in his shirt pocket, and he went back down to the shelter and drove the last nails as the light failed, and he said nothing about it to Sadie that night. She had enough sitting on her already, but she found out anyway, the way she found out most things, because a few days later a man came up the lane. He came in a clean truck, the way they always did, and he stepped out and introduced himself as Curtis Sheldon, the branch manager, and he had the smooth, untroubled face of a man who has never in his life had to move a frightened animal through rising water in the dark. Alden met him in the yard and did not ask him inside. Sadie stood behind the screen door, half hidden, and listened. Sheldon was sorry about the flooding. He said so, and he arranged his face to look it. He understood. These things were hard, he said, especially for a man who had put so many years into a place. He wanted Alden to know the bank was on his side in this, but he wanted Alden to be realistic too, and here his voice cooled but by a few degrees and became the voice of a man reading figures off a page. The loan, he said, 42,000 still outstanding. A man could not make payments on a farm that could not grow. And if the flooding continued, if this season was lost, and perhaps the next, well, there were provisions in the agreement Mr. Boyd had signed, provisions the bank was entitled to act upon when the value of secured property declined. One more failed season, Sheldon said, and the bank might have no choice but to consider foreclosure. He said it gently. That was the worst of it. He said it the way you would offer a man your condolences. Alden stood in his own yard and looked at this man, and he did not argue, because he had learned long ago that arguing with a certain kind of man only gives him the pleasure of watching you come apart. He looked past Sheldon at the levee, dark and solid at the edge of his fields, and at the water lying flat and patient across his land, and when he finally spoke, he said something that made the branch manager's smooth face falter. The water's going the wrong way, Alden said. Sheldon blinked. I'm sorry? You'll understand it soon enough, the old man said. That ground out there has been here a lot longer than your blueprints. It knows where it means to go, and that wall of yours has got it going the wrong way. Sheldon did not know what to do with that. He recovered, and he smiled, and he said something about hoping they could resolve all this sensibly, and he set his card on the porch rail and drove back down the lane. But the smile had cracked for just a second before he caught it, and Alden had seen the crack, and he tucked it away where he kept such things. That night, Sadie could not let it alone. She sat at the old kitchen table with the loan papers spread out in front of her, the whole thick stack, because she was 20 and quick with words on a page in a way her grandfather had never been, and she read them by the lamp with her jaw set hard. Alden watched her from his chair, his father's chair. He had expected anger, and there was anger, but underneath it, he saw something he had not expected and did not like, and it was fear. Grandpa, she said at last, and her voice went careful, the careful voice of a person about to say a hard thing out loud. He wasn't bluffing. It's right here. She turned a page toward him and set her finger on a paragraph dense with the small, cruel language of contracts. There's a clause. If the property value drops far enough, they can reassess the whole loan. They can move up the schedule. They can make you pay it all a lot faster than you ever agreed to. She looked up, and the lamplight caught the wet standing in her eyes. And if you can't pay it that fast. She did not finish. She did not have to. Alden sat very still. Outside in the dark, the water lay across his fields, and somewhere under it the wheat was rotting, and now he understood the full shape of the thing that had come for him. It was not simply a flood. A flood was weather, and weather passed. This was a machine, patient and deliberate, and it had many parts, and every part turned toward the same end, which was to take his land. The levee pushed the water. The water killed the crop. The dead crop dropped the value. The dropped value tripped the clause. The clause moved up the debt, and the debt, when he could not meet it, would hand them the very ground they had failed to buy, for nothing at all. He looked across the table at his granddaughter's frightened face, and he understood that already, in some quiet corner of herself, she had begun doing the arithmetic that led toward selling, toward taking whatever the bank would give and getting out from under this before it broke them both. He could not blame her for it. She was young, and she loved him, and she was afraid of watching an old man be ground down. "We're not selling," he said. "Grandpa, we're not selling." He said it again, and something in the way he said it stopped her. It was not stubbornness, though later people would call it that. It was certainty. He had read the water, and the water had told him something, and he had lived long enough to trust what the land told him over what any man in a clean truck said across a table. "That water is wrong," he said. "It's going where water doesn't go. And when a thing goes where it shouldn't, there is always a reason, and a reason can be found." He reached across and laid his old scarred hand over her young one. "They think this is about money. They think if they squeeze hard enough, I'll break the way everybody breaks. But this was never about money. This is about the land. And I know this land better than those men know their own names." She looked at him a long moment. She wanted to believe him. He could see her wanting to. But she was young, and fear is loud in the young, and belief is a hard thing to hold when the water is already at your door. "How?" she said finally. "How do you find a reason for water?" And Alden Boyd, 72 years old, in his father's chair, in his leaning wooden house at the edge of his drowning fields, felt something move behind his eyes that was almost, after 2 weeks of dread, like hope. "By asking somebody who was here before any of us," he said, "before the bank, before the maps they're using, before all of it." The answer came, as answers often do in that country, from an old man on the next place over. His name was Harlan Pruitt, and he was 78, 6 years older than Alden, and a lifetime deeper into the memory of the Low Country, because Harlan had been born there and had never once left it, had watched the ground change through a longer window than anyone else still living. He drove over the day after Sheldon's visit, slow up the lane in a truck near as old as Alden's tractor, and the two men stood at the edge of the flooded ground the way old men stand, hands in their pockets, saying little, letting the silence do the early work of a hard conversation. Harlan looked at the water a good while. He looked at the wall, and then he said, a thing that turned the whole matter on its hinge, though neither of them knew it yet. "You know," he said slowly, working his jaw the way he did when he was reaching back a long way, "that ground where they put that wall, where all them yellow machines are sitting, that wasn't always dry ground, Alden. Long time back, before any of these levees, before your daddy even, that low stretch there was a channel. Water come down out of the north, through there every spring, cross the flats, and run on south into Cedar Creek. Natural as breathing, that was just where the water went." Alden turned and looked at him. "A channel, a flood channel. My daddy walked me out and showed it to me when I wasn't but a boy. Told me you don't build in it and you don't fight it. You just let the water use it come spring, and it lets you be the rest of the year." He nodded at the raw dark wall. "Now they've gone and dropped that thing right across the top of it. And I'll tell you what I've known my whole life, and what they apparently never troubled to learn." He paused. "You can block off where water wants to go, but you cannot make it stop wanting to go there. Cork it up in one place, it don't just quit and disappear. It finds another way. It always finds another way." The words settled over Alden like a key finally turning in a lock he had been feeling for in the dark. The water was always going the wrong way, because its right way had been shut. It was not lying on his fields because the slope had put it there. It was there because something had blocked the road it had traveled since before there were maps to draw it. And now it was loose in the country and looking for the sea the only way left to it. "You got any proof of that?" Alden asked, and his voice was quiet with the care of a man who has just seen a door where he thought there was only wall. "That channel. Anything a man could put his hand on and lay on a table?" Harlan was quiet a moment. "Your daddy might," he said. "Your daddy was a careful man. Carefuller than most of us. Back in the 50s, when the county sent all them surveyors through here doing the drainage studies and the flood maps and all that, Most folks just pitched the papers in the stove, but not your daddy. He looked toward the old leaning house, the barn, the outbuildings behind. Your daddy kept things. If there was ever a record made of that old channel, of where the water ran before anybody walled it off, I would lay money it's still somewhere on this place. He'd have kept it. He kept everything. And Alden Boyd stood at the edge of his flooded fields with the smell of rot on the evening air and the levee going black against the failing light, and he felt something he had not felt in the 2 long weeks since he had walked out onto that porch and found his world underwater. He felt the ground shift, just slightly, under the men who thought they had him. Because somewhere in that old house, in some box or drawer or trunk, his father's careful hands had filled and closed and set aside a lifetime ago, there might be a single sheet of paper that knew a truth all the bank's $68 million had never once thought to ask about. Behind the screen door, unseen, Sadie stood watching the two old men at the fence, not yet knowing what they had found in each other's silence, knowing only that her grandfather, who had stood bent and quiet under all of it for 2 weeks, was standing now the way a man stands when he has finally caught sight of the far edge of the thing that has been chasing him. That night, for the first time since it began, Alden did not lie awake, listening to the water in the dark. He lay awake thinking about a metal box, and about his father's careful hands, and about a channel that had carried the spring floods south to Cedar Creek since before anyone now living could remember, running quiet and certain beneath everything the bank had raised on top of it, waiting, the way water always waits, to be proven right. They found it on the third day of looking. The search began the very next morning, and it went slowly, because a lifetime of a careful man's keeping does not give itself up all at once. Alden's father had kept things the way some men pray, quietly and constantly and without ever explaining why. And the house and the barn and the two sagging outbuildings behind them were full of the sediment of that keeping, layers of it, decades deep. There were drawers that had not been pulled open since the old man died. There were boxes stacked on boxes in the loft of the barn, coffee cans of bent nails sorted by size, seed catalogs from years when Alden himself had been a boy in short pants. Sadie worked through all of it beside him, and something in her had changed since that night at the kitchen table, some of the fear burned off by the plain physical labor of the search, because it is hard to stay only afraid when your hands are busy hunting a way out. It was Sadie who found the box, in the end, in the far corner of the oldest outbuilding, under a tarp gone stiff and gray with age, beneath a leaning stack of old window screens her grandfather did not even remember owning. A metal strongbox the size of a small suitcase, its green paint flaked down to rust at the corners, and heavy, heavy enough that she called out to him before she had even worked the lid free. "Grandpa, come here. There's something in here." He came, wiping his hands on his trousers, and knelt beside her in the dusty light falling through the one small window, and together they worked the latch, which had rusted half shut, until it gave. He lifted the lid. Inside was paper, his father's paper. Land deeds folded into thirds, their creases soft as cloth from age. Tax records. Survey documents on the heavy stock they used to use, the kind meant to last a century. Drainage records, page on page of them, the county's old patient accounting of how the water moved through the low country. And near the bottom, folded once and laid flat as though it had been set there with some care, a map. Alden lifted it out with both hands. The way you lift a thing you already have false suspect is worth more than it looks. A survey map, printed in color once, though the color had faded to the ghosts of itself, the blues gone to gray and the greens to a pale tobacco brown. Along its bottom edge, in a draftsman's careful hand, ran a date from the middle of the last century, the seal of the county, and words about drainage and watershed and flood control. He unfolded it slowly across the dusty floorboards, and Sadie leaned in at his shoulder, and for a moment neither of them breathed. There it was. A line ran across the old map, a curving blue line drawn by a hand that had plainly walked the very ground it described, and it began up in the north, in the flats, where the bank had raised its levee, and it ran down across the low country, across ground Alden knew in his body to be his own fields, and it bent south and joined, clear as anything, The thin blue thread the map named Cedar Creek. The channel. The channel Harlan had carried in his memory for 70 years, set down here in faded ink by a surveyor who had stood in that water and marked where it ran. Decades before the bank existed, before the project, before anyone had thought to close it off. Alden set his finger on the line and traced it, north to south, and his hand was not quite steady. "That's it," he said softly. "That's the road the water takes." Sadie looked from the map to his face. "This proves it. This proves the water's supposed to run south, right through where they built." "It proves more than that," Alden said, and his voice had dropped into a low intensity she had not heard in it before. He was looking at the map the way he looked at the sky before weather, reading past what was drawn to what it meant. He laid the map flat on the floor and studied the curving line. And, in his mind, he set it down over the country he had walked for 50 years, laid it over the levee, and the drowned fields, and the places where the water had risen that made no earthly sense. And slowly, kneeling there in the dust, he understood not only that the bank had blocked the channel, but exactly how the blocking of it had drowned him. Because the map showed where the channel came down out of the north. And the levee, when he set the two together in his mind, had been raised almost precisely across the mouth of it, not near it, across it. They had built their wall of packed earth directly over the throat of the old water road, and stoppered it as complete as a cork stoppers a bottle. And water that cannot go where it means to go does not simply stop and sit. Harlan had said as much. It finds another way. But Alden understood the other way now, in a manner Harlan never had. Understood it with the particular knowledge of a man who has dug 10,000 post holes in his life and knows to the inch what lies beneath the skin of his own ground. Below the clay, his plow turned. Below the good black dirt, there was sand. He had struck it all his life, digging deep, a pale wet layer of it that held water and moved water, running through the whole low country like a hidden river beneath the visible one. When the levee corked the surface channel, the water had been forced down into that sand, and once in the sand it had gone where the sand went, sideways and under, beneath the wall, beneath the fields, until it reached the low places and pushed up from below. That was why the water lay where the slope could not explain it. It was not running across his fields at all. It was rising up through them, welling from underneath, forced up out of the sand by the weight of everything the levee had dammed behind it. The flood was not on his land. It was coming out of his land. He said all of it to Sadie, slowly, tracing it on the map in the dusty light, and he watched the understanding move from his mind into hers, watched her follow it until she saw the whole hidden machinery of the thing, the surface and the sand and the drowned wheat, all of it linked, all of it explained by one faded line on one old sheet of paper his father had thought to keep. "They didn't just push the water sideways," she said quietly. "They pushed it underground, and it came up under us." "That's right. Can you prove that part? That it's coming up from underneath and not just running in?" Alden folded the map back along its old creases, careful of them, as if they were seams in something living. "Not yet," he said, "but I know it's true. And a thing that's true can be made to show itself. You just have to know where to stand and how to ask." They did not have long to work it out because 3 days after they found the box, the bank moved to bury what was in it. Word had gotten around, the way word does in a county where everyone knows everyone. The stubborn old farmer who would not sell, the flooding, the trouble out at the Meridian site, all of it had become the thing men chewed over at the feed store and the cafe counter, and the bank did not care to be chewed over. So they called a meeting, and they framed it, of course, as an act of plain transparency, a public gathering to reassure the county and the neighboring landowners that the Meridian Logistics Park had been engineered responsibly and that its levee had nothing whatever to do with the water standing on the Boyd place. They invited the county commissioners, the project engineers, and every landowner whose ground touched the low country, and they held it in the meeting room at the county building under the flat hum of fluorescent light. Alden went. Sadie drove him. Harlan rode along in the back, and Alden held the metal box on his knees the whole way there, both hands flat on the lid, saying nothing. The room was near full when they came in. The commissioners sat at a long table at the front. Off to one side, the bank's people had set up, and Alden saw Curtis Sheldon among them. And beside Sheldon, a row of engineers with laptops open and a projector throwing bright, confident charts up onto a pull-down screen. Charts full of blue arrows and contour lines and figures carried out to the second decimal. There was a younger man among them, thin and serious, who kept his eyes down on his own screen and seemed less easy in that room than the rest. Alden marked him without yet knowing his name was Dale Brennan, or that he would come to matter more than anyone else in it. There were a great many well-dressed people and a great deal of expensive equipment, and laid over all of it the particular ease of people who believe the truth is simply whatever the most sophisticated instrument in the room reports it to be. Alden took a chair at the back, an old man in a clean but faded shirt with a rusted box on his knees, and for the first long while he only listened. The engineers presented. They had modeled the watershed, they explained, using the latest hydrological software, and their models showed conclusively that the levee neither had caused nor could have caused the flooding on adjacent land. They put up the charts, they put up the drainage plan, they used a great many words. Most of the room did not understand, and were not truly meant to understand. Words whose real work was not to explain anything, but to establish who here was the authority and who was not. Flooding on the Boyd property, one of them offered, was most likely the unhappy result of unusual seasonal rainfall meeting the natural low elevation of the land. Nobody's fault. And then Curtis Sheldon rose to his feet, and he did the thing Alden would remember long afterward, the thing that turned out, in the end, to be his mistake. He could not resist it. Perhaps it was the confidence of the room. All those charts, all those decimals, arrayed on his side of the table. Perhaps it was only the kind of man he was. But Sheldon stood up before the commissioners and the engineers and the gathered neighbors, and with a small regretful smile, he explained to them all what he said they ought to understand about the real situation here. Mr. Boyd, he said, was a man behind, on a loan he was struggling to carry. Mr. Boyd had refused several fair and generous offers for his property, and now, faced with the natural consequences of a hard season, Mr. Boyd had begun leveling accusations at the bank, accusations for which there was no engineering basis whatever, in what could only be seen as a transparent attempt to manufacture an excuse, to delay, to wriggle out from under obligations he had freely taken on. Sheldon said he understood it. He even, he said, sympathized. But the county surely could not allow one man's private financial troubles to hold up a $68 million investment in the future of everyone in it. The room turned. Every face in it turned toward the back, toward the old man with the box on his knees. And in that turning was the very thing Sheldon had counted on. The whole weight of a room's judgment settling down onto one person, the expectation that he would color and stammer and shrink under it. Alden Boyd sat still beneath all those eyes and did not color and did not stammer. He set the metal box on the empty seat beside him and opened it, and while the room watched, drew out the old map and unfolded it slowly along its soft creases, and he rose and carried it to the front and laid it down on the long table beside the engineer's bright printed charts. It looked like nothing. That was the first reaction. A faded, watercolored old thing, its ink gone to ghosts, set down next to the crisp modern documents of the project. Somebody laughed. It was a small laugh, quickly swallowed, but it was real. The laugh of people watching an old man bring a scrap of the past to a fight about the future. Sheldon let the laugh do his work for him. He asked in a voice, pitched to carry to the commissioners, whether the county was truly being asked to weigh a 70-year-old piece of paper against hundreds of thousands of dollars of professional engineering study. Alden did not answer that question. He had learned long ago that you do not answer the question a man asks in order to make you look small. You ask him a better one. He stood at the table with his finger resting on the faded blue curve of the channel, and he looked past Sheldon at the engineers, and at the young serious one in particular, and he asked them a question. How deep did you drill, he said. When you tested this ground, the room quieted. It was not the question anyone had been braced for. There was a pause. And then one of the engineers, with a glance toward the young man, allowed that soil borings had of course been taken across the site as a matter of standard procedure. Alden nodded, patient. How deep, he said again. And the young engineer, Dale Brennan, looked at his screen and then at the old map lying on the table, and something crossed his face, and he answered honestly, because he was, it turned out, the kind of man who answered honestly, even when it cost him something to do it. The borings, he said, had gone down something less than 5 feet. The upper soil layers had appeared stable and consistent, and there had been no indication, at that depth, of anything that would bear on the levee's design. Less than 5 feet, Alden repeated, quietly, so the whole room heard it land. He put his finger back on the map. Men who made this, he said, 70 years ago, with nothing but chains and rods and their own 2 eyes, they marked a channel that runs through here. Not on top of the ground, under it. There's a layer of sand down there, deeper than you dug, and it carries water, and it has carried water south toward that creek since before this county had a name to put on a map. You drilled 5 feet, and you found what you expected to find, and you stopped. But the water doesn't stop at 5 feet. The water's deeper than that, and you built your wall square across the top of where it comes out. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He only laid the thing out plain, the way he had laid the map on the table, and let it sit there in the humming light beside all the charts and the laptops and the $68 million, one old man's finger on one faded line, asking the single question all the modern instruments in the room had never once thought to ask, because every one of them had been trained on the surface, and the truth of this was underneath. The room did not laugh. Now, the commissioners looked at one another. They were not engineers, and they were not about to decide a $68 million question on the strength of one old map, and they said as much. But most of them were local men, men who had grown up in this low country and knew in their own bones that the old-timers had understood the water in ways no software necessarily had, and what the old man had shown them was enough. Enough to raise a question that could not simply be laughed back down into its box. They conferred among themselves at the front table, low and serious. And then the chairman said that in light of the concerns raised, the county would arrange for an independent inspection team, engineers with no tie to the bank or the project, to examine the Boyd property and the levee and determine, once and for all, how the water was truly moving through that ground. It was not victory, but it was a crack in the wall, and Alden saw Sheldon's smooth face tighten when the chairman said it, and he knew he had opened something that would not easily be closed again. The bank did not take the crack quietly. If anything, the pressure sharpened after that meeting, grew more personal and more urgent, as though the bank understood that the ground was beginning to shift and meant to close its grip before it could slip away entirely. In the days while Alden waited for the independent team to be assembled and scheduled, the letters kept coming, and the phone calls, each one circling back to the same cold arithmetic. Every day the water sits on your fields, the farm loses value. Every day the value slides, the loan grows more precarious. The investigation, the letters implied, was only a distraction, a costly delay that helped no one and hurt Mr. Boyd worst of all. And would it not be wiser? Would it not be kinder to his granddaughter and to himself to accept the bank's generous offer now, before the season was wholly lost and the clause came due and there was nothing left to sell? It was pressure engineered as carefully as any levee, and it was built to do the same work, to force what would not move on its own. And it worked on Sadie a little, the way water works on Earth, slowly, invisibly, from underneath. Alden saw it in her. She did not say it outright again. Not after that first night, but he saw it in the way she went quiet when the mail came, in the tightness at the corners of her eyes, when the phone rang in the evening, and one night it came out of her in a question as they sat on the porch watching the last light die over the flooded ground. What if the team says it isn't the levee? She asked. What if they take their samples and they side with the bank anyway? Because the bank has all the money and all the experts, and all we've got is you and a map. She turned to him, and there it was again, worn down but not gone. The fear. We could lose everything, Grandpa. The land, the house, All of it. If we'd just taken that first offer, we'd at least have walked away with something in our hands. And every single day we wait, that clause gets closer. She looked down at her own hands in her lap. I'm not saying sell. I'm not. I'm just saying I'm scared. I'm scared you're betting the whole place on a piece of paper. Alden was quiet a long moment. He did not think her fear was foolish. It was the sensible fear of a person who has already learned, young as she was, that money usually wins in the end. But he had lived a good deal longer than she had, and he had learned something else along the way, something the young rarely believe until they have seen it with their own eyes, which is that the truth, if you can once get it to stand up plainly where people have to look at it, carries a weight that money cannot always shove aside. I'm not betting on the paper, he said finally. The paper only tells us where to look. I'm betting on the ground, and the ground does not lie, Sadie. Men lie. Numbers can be made to lie by men who know how. The water goes where the water goes, and if I can make it show them where it goes, then all their money in the world won't change what they're looking at. He reached over and covered her hand with his. But I'll tell you this, I am not going to sit here on this porch and wait for their team to maybe find it for us. If that water is coming up from underneath, then I am going to go out there and find where. She frowned. How? The old way, he said. The only way a man ever finds anything in his own ground. He goes out into it, and he looks. The next morning came gray and still, the water lying flat and silver across the low fields, and Alden Boyd walked down to the barn and started the old tractor. It took him 3 tries, and a hand laid flat on the warm hood and a few low words said under his breath, the way it always did on a damp morning, but it caught, coughing blue smoke into the cold air and settling into the deep uneven rhythm he had listened to across 50 years of mornings. He climbed up into the seat his father had worn smooth, and he drove it out of the barn and down toward the water, and he did not stop at the edge of it. He drove straight in. Sadie stood in the yard and watched him go, the old man on the old machine rolling out into the silver flood until the water rose over the axles, and the tractor pushed a slow wake ahead of it. And she brought her hand up to her mouth because there was something in the sight of it that went straight past her fear and into some older, deeper place, small and stubborn and unafraid, going alone to put to the land the one question all the engineers with all their instruments had never thought to ask. He was not hunting the deepest water. He had thought it through in the night. He was hunting the places where the water was rising, where it welled up from below rather than lying still on the surface. And a man who has spent his life reading ground can find such places if he goes slow and pays close attention. Every few dozen yards, he stopped the tractor and shut it off and climbed down into the cold water. And he carried with him a long steel rod, and he drove it down into the soft, flooded earth as far as it would go and drew it back out and studied what came up on the end of it. Most places it came up dark, heavy black clay, the good clay he had farmed his whole life, dense and clinging. But at certain places, and he began to find pattern in them, the rod came up wrong, came up smeared at the tip with something pale and fine sand, clean sand where clean sand had no business being, up this near the surface in ground that ought to have been all clay for feet down. He found it first near a low spot where the surface of the water seemed faintly troubled, stirred, not dead still like the rest, and he stood there a long moment looking at the pale grit on the end of the rod. And then he took a strip of cloth from his coat pocket and tied it to the nearest strand of fence wire, a marker, and climbed back up and drove on. He worked that way all morning, deeper and deeper into the drowned fields, and behind him the fence wires began to bloom with little rags of cloth, each one flagging a place where the sand came up where no sand should be. And slowly, without a single chart or computer or decimal point, driving an old tractor through cold silver water, Alden Boyd was mapping the hidden river running beneath his land. It was mid-morning when he became aware he was being watched. A truck had come up the lane and stopped, and a man had climbed out and walked down to the water's edge, and Alden knew him even at that distance by the thin, serious set of him. The young engineer from the meeting, the one who had answered the hard question honestly, stood at the edge of the flood in good boots that were about to be ruined, watching the old man work. And after a while, Alden turned the tractor and drove it back toward him and shut it off and climbed down with the steel rod in his hand. And the two of them stood facing each other across a few feet of still silver water. I heard about what you were doing out here, Brennan said. I wanted to see it for myself. Alden held out the rod so the young man could see the pale smear along its tip. Sand, he said, up near the top, all through this stretch, in spots. This shallow, the ground's supposed to be clay, but the water's bringing this up. He nodded back over his shoulder at the flags of cloth strung out across the wires. Every place I've marked, it comes up sand. Brennan looked at the rod, and Alden watched him reach, the way engineers are trained to reach, for the explanation that required no one to have made a mistake. The sand, Brennan said carefully, might well have been carried there by the floodwater itself. Surface water moving across the fields could pick up sediment and set it down again elsewhere. It did not necessarily indicate anything about deep flow. It could be nothing more than surface deposition. Alden did not argue with him. He had learned somewhere along the years that arguing with a certain kind of educated man only makes him hold the tighter to what he has already decided. So he did the thing he had done his whole life, which was to let the ground itself make the argument. Maybe so, he said. Come here. I'll show you one. He waded out to the nearest marked spot, and Brennan, after a moment's hesitation, followed him, ruining his good boots without seeming to notice, and Alden knelt down in the shallow water and began to dig. He dug with a short spade he had carried out on the tractor, down through the flooded surface and into the ground beneath, widening a hole in the soft earth, and Brennan crouched at his shoulder and watched. For a minute, there was nothing but the wet sound of the spade and the slop of the water. And then it happened, the thing Alden had known would happen, because he had felt the truth of it in his bones since the gray morning he had walked out onto the porch. Water began to rise from the bottom of the hole. Not water running in from the sides, from the flood standing all around them, water welling up from the very bottom, from below, cold and clear where the floodwater was warm and murky, pushing up out of the pale sand at the base of the hole with a slow, steady pressure that had nothing to do with the still water at their knees. Alden stopped digging, and the two men watched, and the flow did not stop. It strengthened. It rose into the hole and stirred the sand at the bottom and kept pushing up, clear and cold and unmistakable, water being forced out of the ground under pressure, driven up from somewhere below by a weight neither man could see. Dale Brennan crouched in the ruin of his good boots and looked at the water rising out of the earth. And he said nothing about surface deposition. He said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he reached down and put his hand flat into the flow and felt the cold of it, felt the wrongness of it, the way it came up against his palm from underneath. And something shifted in his young, serious face, some certainty that had been sitting behind his eyes since his first year in an engineering classroom, beginning quietly to come loose. That's not surface water, he said at last. It was almost a whisper. No, Alden said. It isn't. They knelt there together a while longer, the old farmer and the young engineer, in the cold rising water in the middle of the drowned field, the gray sky holding its light above them, and the little rags of cloth marking out along the fence wires the hidden course of the thing that had been drowning Alden Boyd's land. And Dale Brennan understood, kneeling there, that he had come out that morning to lay a small doubt to rest, and had instead found the beginning of something that was going to force him, before it was through, to choose between the company that signed his checks and the water that would not stop telling the truth. He drove away quiet that afternoon, and he did not say which way he would go, and Alden did not press him. Some choices a man has to walk all the way around alone before he can make them. The independent team came the following week, 3 engineers on a county contract with no stake in the project either way, and Alden walked them out to his flags of cloth and showed them where to put their rig. They drilled, and they did not stop at 5 feet. They drilled at 3 of the places the old man had marked, and at all 3 they went down through the clay and into what lay beneath it, and at all 3 they struck the same thing, about 8 feet down, a thick, continuous, saturated layer of water-bearing sand, pressurized, hidden river running through the low country, exactly where the old map's faded blue line said the channel had always run. And when they plotted the direction of that underground flow and laid it against the world above, it led without deviation straight back to the north, straight back to the mouth of the old channel, straight back to the foot of the great earthen wall the bank had raised to protect its $68 million project. The very structure built to make the land safe was sitting square across the throat of the water, and the water, denied its road, had gone underground and come up through Alden Boyd's fields exactly as an old man, reading a faded map on a dusty floor, had said it would. The team wrote it up in a preliminary report, careful and technical and quietly damning, and sent it on to the county. And near the end of that report, almost as an afterthought, they set down a single warning that turned Alden's private ruin into the bank's own emergency. If the underground pressure continued to build, the report said, the water kept being forced through that sand with nowhere to escape. It would not stop at flooding the neighboring fields. In time, it would begin to weaken the saturated soil beneath the levee itself. And a levee standing on soil the water was quietly eating away from underneath was a levee that could, in time, threaten the stability of the very foundation it had been built to protect. The wall the bank had raised to hold the water back was being undermined by the water it held back. The county did not wait. On the strength of that one line, the commissioners ordered all construction on the western side of the Meridian project halted at once until a full hydrology study could be completed and the danger properly understood. And out at the site, the yellow machines that had sat quiet in the mornings now went quiet for good. The excavators shut down. The trucks pulled off. The crews were sent home, and the $68 million project the bank had been so certain of stood dead still in the spring light, stopped not by an old man's stubbornness, but by the water itself, rising patient and unstoppable out of the sand along the road it had traveled since before any man there was born. There is a particular quiet that settles over a construction site when the machines stop, and it settled over the Meridian Logistics Park like a held breath. Where there had been the daily roar of excavators and the beeping of trucks in reverse and the shouts of men calling to one another across the pads, there was now only the wind moving over the graded earth and the water standing in the low places, and the yellow machines sat where they had been left, buckets down, going quietly to rust at the edges. And every morning that silence held, it cost the bank money. That was the thing that turned the whole world over, the thing Alden could hardly have imagined 2 months before when he walked out onto his porch and found his fields drowned. Every single day the project sat idle. The bank bled tens of thousands of dollars in delay, in idle equipment and idle crews, and the slow, relentless arithmetic of a $68 million investment earning nothing at all. Only weeks earlier, Curtis Sheldon had sat in Alden's own yard and explained, so gently, that the flood would cost the old man everything he had. Now that same water was costing the bank a fortune with every sunrise, and there was a justice in it so plain and so complete that even Sadie, who had spent those weeks so afraid, went quiet before it. The water the bank had loosed had turned in its bed and come back for the bank. Sheldon did not take it gracefully. He came to the county, and he came loud, and he brought his engineers and their charts, and he argued fiercely that the halt was a gross overreaction, that there was no proof, no definitive proof, that the levee alone was responsible for any of it. It had been a wet spring, he said. The rainfall had been unusual. The low ground had always been prone to standing water. To pin the whole matter on the project, to freeze $68 million of work on the strength of one preliminary report and one old man's faded map was reckless, and the bank would not stand quietly by for it. He was, Alden understood, doing the thing men in his position always do when the ground opens under them. He was refusing to accept responsibility, because to accept it was to lose, and so he blamed the weather, and he blamed the county, and he blamed everything under heaven except the wall of earth his own project had thrown across the throat of the water. Alden listened to all of it, and then at the meeting where the bank made its loudest and most crowded case, the old man stood up and made an offer so simple it cut clean through every chart in the room. If the bank truly believed the levee had nothing to do with the flooding, he said, then let them prove it where a man could see it. Let them open one section of the wall, one at the exact place the old map showed the channel's mouth had been. If the water on his fields did not go down, if opening that wall changed nothing at all, then he would stand up in front of every person in this room and admit he had been wrong, and he would trouble the bank no further. He asked for nothing else. Not charts, not models, not another study written by men paid to reach a conclusion. Just a cut in the wall at the place the map named, and the water's own plain answer to the question. It was, and Alden knew it as he said it, an offer the bank could not easily refuse without looking to the whole county like men afraid of the truth. It carried the argument off the screens and the laptops and set it down on the ground, where a thing can be seen with the naked eye, and it put the bank in the position of having to say, out loud, in front of the commissioners and the neighbors, either that they would test their own confidence or that they did not dare to. Sheldon tried to talk it down. He called it unscientific, a stunt, a piece of theater. But the commissioners, local men who trusted their own eyes over any software ever written, liked it, and after several days of argument back and forth, they ordered it done. The contractor would cut a test trench through the lowest section of the levee, at the place the old map marked, and every interested party would stand there and watch what the water chose to do. They gathered on a bright, cool morning to see it. The commissioners came. The bank's people came. Dale Brennan came, and Alden noted that he stood a little apart from the other engineers now, in a way he had not at the first meeting. Harlan came, leaning on the fence. Sadie stood close beside her grandfather, and a good many of the neighbors came too, because word had spread all through the low country, and everyone wanted to see for themselves whether the old man's map would hold up against $68 million. The excavator crawled up onto the levee at the marked place and set its bucket, and it began to cut, biting down through the packed earth layer by layer, dark soil and pale soil, and for a long while nothing happened at all. The bucket dug, the spoil pile grew beside the cut, and the ground stayed dry. Alden watched without expression, but Sadie felt her heart begin to climb up into her throat, because the longer the machine dug into nothing, the more the bank's people began to ease, to trade small, satisfied looks among themselves. And one of them said, not quite low enough, that this was exactly what they had told everyone all along, that there was nothing down there, that the old man had cost a great many people a great deal of money over a superstition and a scrap of paper. Sheldon began very slightly to smile. The excavator dug deeper, and the trench opened raw and dry through the body of the wall, and still the water did not come. And Sadie reached out and gripped her grandfather's arm hard enough to hurt. Alden did not move. He was watching the sand at the bottom of the cut. And then, not 20 minutes after the digging had begun, the sand began to change. It darkened. Down at the base of the trench, where the bucket had reached the pale layer beneath the clay, a stain crept out across the sand, a wetness spreading, where a moment before there had been none, and Alden's hand found Sadie's and pressed it. The darkening sand began to glisten. And then, all at once, with a sound like a long breath finally let go, the water came. It pushed up through the sand at the bottom of the cut, welling and then surging, cold and clear, and under a pressure not one soul standing there could have mistaken for surface runoff. And it rose into the trench and found the opening and burst through it. And the people nearest the base of the wall stepped back quick, and then further back, as the water broke through and found, for the first time since the levee rose, its old road south. It ran out of the cut and down across the low ground, and it did not wander, and it did not spread aimless. Ran with purpose, cutting a clear channel through the drowned fields straight towards Cedar Creek, dead along the line a surveyor had drawn on a faded map more than 70 years before any man now watching was born. Nobody laughed at the map now. Nobody said anything at all for a moment. They stood in the cool, bright morning and watched the water do the one thing the bank had sworn, on all its charts, it could never do: pour out through the opened wall and take the exact road the old man had said it would take. And the only sounds were the rush of the water, and the wind moving over the fields. And somewhere in that silence, Curtis Sheldon's smile died on his face and did not come back to it. The water ran through that opening all that day and all through the night, draining down toward the creek, and by the next morning, the level standing on Alden's fields had dropped by more than a foot. He and Sadie walked out into the early light to see it, and where there had been a flat silver sheet of water, there was now mud, black glistening mud, and out of the mud rose the ruined stubble of the drowned wheat and the leaning fence posts and all the broken evidence of the lost season. But the water was going, running off day by day toward the creek the way it was always meant to. And the plain sight of his own ground coming back to him, ruined as it was, wrecked as it was the first thing in 2 long months that made Alden Boyd's throat go tight. But the falling water only opened the door on to something larger. Because when the county's investigators, having cause now, went deeper into the project's own records, they turned up a thing the bank had buried, and the finding of it changed the whole nature of the case. Before the levee was ever built, a consulting engineer named Ellison Ashford had been hired to study the project's drainage plan, and he had written a report, and in that report he had warned, in plain unmistakable language, that blocking the natural low ground could alter the underground water pressure and cause flooding on the neighboring properties. He had seen it. Years before the water ever rose on Alden's fields, a man the bank itself had paid had looked at the plan and seen exactly what would happen and set it down in writing. And the bank had read that report, and the bank had understood it, and the bank had gone ahead regardless, because redesigning the levee to respect the old channel would have delayed the project by months and added a great deal of cost. And someone in a room somewhere had weighed it and decided that the risk of drowning a neighbor's land was the cheaper of the two. When that document came into the light, the whole matter stopped being about an engineering mistake. A mistake is a thing done in ignorance. This had been done in full knowledge. The bank had been told, plainly and in advance, and the bank had chosen, and now that choice sat in the record where anyone at all could read it. Alden did not gloat when he learned of it. He got a lawyer. There is a difference, at 72, between being proven right and being made whole, and he had come to the point where he meant to be made whole. The lawyer was a plain-spoken woman from the county seat, and she filed suit against the bank, and the suit demanded payment for the lost crops and the ruined fences and the cost of restoring the drowned land and the expense of having moved the livestock to high ground. But she made a larger claim than that, one that reached past the flood itself to the thing that lay beneath it. The bank, she argued, had deliberately pressured an old man to sell his land after the bank's own project had caused the very flooding that destroyed that land's value. And because the bank held Alden's loan, the same institution that had drowned his fields also held the debt. The drowning was engineered to make him unable to pay. She asked the court to look hard at the whole shape of it, the warnings that the property would lose value. The offer pitched a full third below what the land was worth, the clause that would have snapped the debt shut the instant the value fell. She asked the court to weigh whether the bank had knowingly built a man's ruin in order to take through foreclosure what it had failed to buy across a table. Trial was the kind of thing that draws a whole county in off its porches. The little courtroom filled every day, and Alden sat at the plaintiff's table in the same clean faded shirt he had worn to the very first meeting, and the bank's lawyers filled the other table in suits that cost more than his tractor, and the case was laid out piece by piece across the better part of 2 weeks. Old map was entered into evidence. The independent report was entered. Ellison Ashford was called to the stand, and he testified plainly, an honest engineer describing the warning he had given, and then watched the bank set aside. And Dale Brennan was called, too, and the young man told the court, under oath, what he had seen with his own eyes kneeling in that flooded field, cold water rising up out of the ground against his open hand, and he did not soften a word of it to shield the people who had once paid his salary. Alden watched him testify and thought that the young man had chosen well in the end, and that it had cost him something real to do it, and he respected him the more for both of those things being true at once. But in the end, It was the bank's own words that broke the case open. The court had ordered the bank to turn over its internal records, the emails and the memos, the private back and forth of the project. And among the thousands of pages, there was one short message that silenced the whole courtroom when the lawyer read it out. It had been written by a project executive named Preston Vane, written during the very weeks the bank was pressing Alden hardest to sell, and in it Vane had set down, in the flat, unguarded language of a man who believes no eyes outside the company will ever fall on his words, the plain calculation that sat at the cold heart of the whole business. If the farm flooded for one more season, Vane had written, the owner would likely have no choice left but to sell. The lawyer read it once. Then she read it again, slowly, and let it hang there in the still air of the courtroom. If the farm flooded for one more season, the owner would have no choice but to sell. There it was, in black ink written in their own hand. The intention underneath all the gentle talk of protecting Mr. Boyd from risk. They had not feared the flood on his behalf at all. They had counted on it. Had looked at the water climbing across in an old man's fields and seen in it not a disaster but a lever, and they had put that in writing and filed it away. The judge, hearing it, ordered the investigation widened, ordered the entire history of the land purchase pulled into the light, from the first soft warnings that the property would lose value, to the lowball offer, to the clause buried in the loan. And after that, there was really no question left of how the thing would end. There was only the weighing of it and the accounting. Final ruling, when it came down, fell on the bank with a weight that satisfied even the neighbors who had come to sit in the back and watch. The court ordered the bank to pay for every dollar of damage the flood had caused, every acre of lost crop, every fallen fence, every cost of restoration. It ordered the bank to bear the full cost of repairing the drainage it had wrecked, of undoing what it had done to the water. And it did one thing more, one thing Alden had never dared to ask for, one thing that made Sadie press her hand flat over her mouth when the judge spoke it aloud. It ordered the bank to erase the loan. The whole $42,000, the debt that had hung over the farm for years and that the bank had meant all along to use as the blade at the old man's throat, wiped clean, gone, struck from the books, because the court found it could not in conscience allow the same institution that had deliberately drowned a man's living to turn around and collect on the ruin it had authored. And the project itself, the great $68 million promise, was forbidden to go forward under its original design. The bank would have to tear out and rebuild the levee. It would have to reopen the old drainage route, the channel the map had named, and prove, before it laid another wall, its new plan would let the water run its ancient road south to the creek instead of forcing it up through the fields of the men who farmed alongside. The land the bank had schemed so hard to force Alden to sell had become the very reason the entire project had to be torn up and begun again. The thing they had dismissed as an obstacle in the road had become the thing the law now required them to protect. But winning in a courtroom does not drain a field, and it does not unrot a crop, and when the water was finally gone and Alden could walk his low ground once more, he found that being made whole in law was not at all the same as being made whole in dirt. The lowest 18 acres, the ground that had stood underwater longest, had changed, and not for the better. The soil there held water now, in a way it never had before, sullen and slow to let go of it. The surface had been disturbed and had settled back wrong. To force that ground back into wheat, fill it and drain it and fight it season after season, would take more work than an old man had left in his arms, with no promise at the end of any of it that the ground would ever again grow what it once had grown so freely. Stood out there one evening in the failing light, looking at those 18 ruined acres, and he did not feel triumph. He felt the old plain weariness of a man facing a piece of ground that will not do what he needs it to do. And he began, out of a lifetime's hard habit, to plan how he would fight it, how he would haul in fill and cut new drainage and beat the low ground back into submission the way he always had. And then, standing there, he stopped himself, because a thought came to him that his own father might have had, or his father's father before him, a thought older than the whole quarrel with the bank. He remembered stories from his boyhood, stories his father used to tell of an evening, about the low, wet places in this country that had always held water in certain seasons, the natural sinks and hollows, where the spring flood gathered and the birds came down in their thousands, and how the old people had not fought those places at all, but had simply let them be the thing they were. And Alden Boyd, 72 years old, standing at the edge of the ground that had so nearly cost him everything, began to wonder whether he had spent his whole life doing to that low corner exactly what the bank had done to the water, trying to force it to be a thing it was not, instead of taking the time to understand the thing it wanted to be. He brought in a man who understood such matters, a conservation specialist from the state, and the specialist walked those 18 acres slowly over the course of several visits, and then told Alden something that reframed the whole ruined corner of his farm in the space of a single afternoon. This ground, the specialist said, lay directly along a route the water birds used in their long migrations, the ducks and the geese and the wading birds, following the water south in the fall and north again in the spring. And low, wet ground like this, if it were only allowed to hold its water through the seasons, would be no waste at all. It would be a wetland, a true one, and it would draw the birds down out of the sky by the thousands, and it would hold and filter the spring flood, and shelter the soil, and it would be, in its own quiet way, more alive and more valuable than the wheat field it had failed for years to be. And the state, the specialist said, had a program. If Alden agreed to keep that low ground as it plainly wanted to be, to maintain it for water storage and soil protection and habitat for the migrating birds, the program would pay him for it, year on year, a steady sum for doing very nearly what the land was already bent on doing all by itself. Alden thought about it a long time, the way he thought about everything worth thinking about. And then he said yes. It changed the farm in a way he could never have planned and had never once expected. The yearly conservation payment came in whether the wheat did well or poorly, a steady thing, unhooked at last from the endless gamble of the weather. And there was more to it than that. In the seasons and the ways the law allowed, he could lease the wetland out for careful, managed hunting of the very waterfowl the marsh now drew down, and that brought in its own income, so that the low ground, which for years had given him nothing but grief, now gave him money in two separate streams. Neither one hung on a single crop in a single uncertain year. The farm, for the first time in the whole of Alden's long life on it, no longer stood or fell on whether the wheat came in. It stood on more than the one leg. The irony of it was not lost on him, and it was not lost on Sadie, and it was surely not lost on the neighbors, who spoke of it for years afterward at the feed store and the cafe. The very ground the bank had pointed to as its proof that the farm was becoming worthless, the drowned low corner they had used to argue that the old man ought to sell before it dragged him under for good, had become the single most reliable asset on the whole place. It had become the thing that steadied him, that kept him clear of the bank's books. That meant he would never again have to walk into that building with his hat in his hands to beg a loan because a growing season had gone against him. The weakness they had tried so hard to turn against him had become, in the end, his strength, and it had become his strength for one reason only, because he had finally stopped fighting the water and started listening to what it had been trying to tell him all along. A few years passed, and the Meridian Logistics Park was finished at last, but it did not look like the thing they had first drawn up on their bright screens. It could not. The bank had been made to leave a wide green corridor straight through the property, an open path where no warehouse would ever stand, to protect the ancient water route it had once tried so hard to cork. The new drainage was built so the water could run its old road south to Cedar Creek freely, the way it had run before any of them came into this country, and the levee that remained was a humbler thing, built now to work with the water instead of against it. And in the county offices, a quiet thing happened that pleased Alden more than any dollar of the settlement had. The old map, the faded survey his careful father had thought to save, the scrap of paper-grown engineers had laughed at across a meeting table, was entered by the county into the required reference records for any major construction that might in the future affect the drainage of the low country. The old knowledge had been written back into the law of the place. It would not be laughed at again. Dale Brennan came out to the farm one last time, a good while after all of it was over and settled. He was not with the bank anymore. That had cost him, as Alden had known that morning in the flooded field it likely would. But the young man did not carry himself like someone who regretted the price. He walked the edge of the new wetland with the old farmer in the long spring light, and he said the thing he had driven out there to say, which was that he had turned it over in his mind for a long time, and had come at last to believe the mistake had never truly been in the equipment, or the software, or the models. The mistake, Brennan said, had been in believing that if a thing did not show up on their new maps, then the thing no longer existed. The underground channel had been there the whole while. The water had been keeping to its old path the whole while. Their instruments had only been built by men who quietly assumed the world had begun. On the morning they first started measuring it, the history of the land had not vanished, he said, simply because someone had gone and built something new on top of it. Alden nodded, because it was true, and because it was the very thing he had understood, standing on his porch that first gray morning, without ever having the words to say it. He had not beaten the bank because he knew more engineering than their engineers. He knew almost none. He had beaten them because he had lived on that ground for 50 years and had come to understand it the way you come to understand an old friend, its moods, and its habits, and the few places where it simply would not be argued with, and because when the moment came, he had trusted that understanding over every chart in the room. The bank had brought $68 million and a whole wall of expertise to bear, and all of it had broken, in the end, against one old man who simply would not believe that the water was there for no reason. Many years later, the tractor that was more than 50 years old still sat in the barn beside the old leaning house, and the house still faced, across the yard, the 18 acres of low ground that had become a seasonal marsh. Every spring the water came back to it, the way it had always wanted to, gathering in the low places, catching the gray light of the morning sky the way it had that first ruinous April. But it was not a sign of ruin anymore. It was not the bank's water, or the flood's water, or a thing to be feared and fought. Birds came down onto it out of the long sky, the ducks and the geese wheeling in at dusk, and grass grew thick and green along its edges, and the spring flood filled it and drains loads to the south along the road it had traveled, since before there were maps, or banks, or men to stand and argue over the running of it. Alden Boyd grew old on that farm, older than he had ever expected he would, and he worked the high fields as long as his body would let him while the low ground gave freely without ever being worked. And Sadie stayed on through it all, and the place held. On the spring evenings, he would walk out to the edge of the marsh and stand a while in the last of the light and watch the birds come in and the water lie silver and still, and he would think, sometimes, of how near he had come to losing every acre of it, and of how the thing that had saved him had been sitting all the while in his father's metal box, and in the long memory of an old neighbor, and down in the ground itself, waiting only to be asked. What everyone had once called the greatest weakness of that farm had become, in the end, its greatest strength. And it had happened for one reason, and one reason only, simpler than all the money and all the engineering and all the law that had been spent to fight over it. It had happened because the man who understood the land best had never once, not for a single day of it, been willing to believe that the water was there for no reason at all.